we are now recording. It says it on your screen, doesn't it?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So,
And I should just say for my filming that I'm talking to Mark helps me, a Quaker friend that I've known for almost 35, if not 40 years. And Mark is one of the forces behind the Northern Spirit radio project in Eau Claire, Wisconsin. And we're now having a discussion on the 14th of July, 2020. Mark.
Michael, thanks again for joining me so soon. It was just a few months ago we were talking. Welcome back to Spirit in Action.
Thank you so much, Mark.
So it's been pretty recent. I hope people did listen to the broadcast that we had back in mid-April, April 18th. We called it Not Our First Pandemic Rodeo, 1918 to 1920. Since then, the shutdown has continued much longer than many people would have hoped or perhaps feared.
Yeah.
And so are there any follow-ups you can give me, Michael, to parallels, perhaps? Maybe it's the same thing happening or differences happening from what happened back in 1918 and what's been happening in 2020 with respect to the pandemic.
Yes. Before I launch into that, I would say how glad I am to be back. When you say our last interview about the flu pandemic of 1918 was 3 months ago, I'm very mindful that so much has happened. It was probably in late March or early April that I called my housemate in one day and said, Jorg, look. And the numbers were 8,999 dead worldwide. That was early April or so, if I remember correctly. And now we're at 500,000. In the United States alone, over 130,000 fatalities from this pandemic. Unfortunately, there are takeaways from the pandemic of a century ago, and I'll just sort of tell a few of them anecdotally. In our PowerPoint presentation called The Killer, which is on our Trace's YouTube channel to see for everyone, part 1, which you've seen, and part 2, which includes some of the more renowned victims of that flu pandemic, we show pictures of a streetcar. I think it was in San Francisco, it might have been Seattle, but anywhere on the West Coast, a man was actually shot by a police officer for not wearing his mask in the streetcar. Streetcars, of course, were considered public spaces, and they were crowded most of the time. So we know from the limited amount of documentation that we can find that already in 1918, there was some friction between those who didn't want to wear a mask and those who did. However, the photographs from that period show basically everybody wearing a mask. And I know a few other examples of people who refused to wear a mask. There is a picture in that slideshow of an African-American man going into a shop, and you can see his mask dangling in his jacket pocket, and he's well-dressed, striped trousers and nice shoes, sturdy leather shoes. So he seems to be a man of some means. He certainly could afford a mask, and he had one in his pocket. It'd be really interesting for me to know, but we can't, going backwards, who in the 1918 pandemic wore their mask happily, who wore their mask grudgingly and said, well, and who refused to wear a mask at all. We know that there were people who were arrested and fined for spitting on the sidewalk during that pandemic. There were people who were also fined and had problems with the authorities for not wearing their mask. But again, one of our great lamentations with that whole story is there's there's a dearth of a lot of contemporary accounts. What I find lamentable, Mark, you asked just now, how's the situation in Germany? Compared to the United States, but also Italy and Spain and Britain, Germany has very good numbers. The percentage of fatalities of people who've died from the coronavirus compared to those who are known to have gotten it are much lower than other countries. Why is this? In Germany, there is a fringe. They've even had rallies in places like Stuttgart, or I think Berlin, maybe Dresden, protesting having to wear a mask and the other restrictions on public life, but those are rare. Otherwise, you see people wearing masks in the trains in any case, and going to seat at a restaurant on the way to the table. People don't have to wear their mask at a table, the wait staff does. So I think one of the reasons that our death rate is so much lower is people are much more willing to wear a mask and not balk at it. I find it regrettable and somewhat mysterious that it seems many of our compatriots have somehow melded the topics, quote, my freedom to not wear a mask versus the public good of wearing a mask. And it's too bad that this has become politicized, because the more pronounced that it becomes politicized, the more that people dig in their heels and they don't want to change their stance either way. Those who are vehemently for mask and those who are vehemently against mask. Here, life has been opening up. I go swimming. I went swimming this morning. It's a great joy after so many months of not swimming. Trains are filling up again. People are flying now to the Mediterranean for holidays, although I wouldn't fly if I didn't have to. Many people are opting, though, to take a vacation this summer in Germany. There are a lot more people taking bike tours, a lot more people going to the Baltic Sea coast and the North Sea coast. So daily life has changed, but it's reopening, and we don't have the recurring spikes that you see in Florida or Texas or California. Yeah, that's what I can say to give you an update at the moment.
You have been stranded essentially in Germany, not unhappily necessarily,
No.
but you were planning to come back to the U.S. because of the planned Baseum tour, everything that was in progress and all of a sudden had to be shifted. Were you prohibited from coming back to the U.S. and are you allowed now? Do you have to come back through? Are they going to lock you up for 2 weeks in between to make sure you're not a carrier? What happens?
I certainly hope not. Just briefly, so the chronology was I had a health issue and I priced having that health issue addressed in Mason City at the hospital, coincidentally where I was born in 1962. It would have cost a quarter of the price to fly back to Germany and go to the hospital here for 6 days that would have cost to do the same procedures in the hospital in Mason City, Iowa. So I flew back and I intended to return March 24th. And soon after I was let out of the hospital after 6 days of hospitalization and different tests, and they all turned out negative. I'm fine. I don't have colon cancer after all, et cetera, et cetera. President Trump, in effect, closed the flights between Europe and the United States, in as far as the United States wouldn't let European nationals in anymore who didn't have a U.S. green card, residency card, or citizenship. So in theory, I probably could have found a flight. There were Americans who live here at that point who hurried to go, quote, back home. I'm a dual citizen. I have citizenship in Germany and the United States, and I have a home here. I teach at the university and I do other things here. So I opted to stay. Then I had an airplane ticket for May 11th after I rebooked, and then that fell through. And then I had one for July 4th, and my flight got canceled. As I understood the woman on the phone, out of 202 seats, either it was my class or it was on the whole plane. I think it was just my economy class. Out of 202 tickets and seats, only 26 were bought or occupied. Anyway, the flight got canceled, and they were going to route me over Munich and Timbuktu and the polar North Cap to get to Kansas City. I said, no, I'm not going to do that. I now have a ticket for early August. I have rented a hotel room at Frankfurt Airport the night before. My plan is to go the day before my flight, to stay at the hotel. I'll get up really early, and I will simply park out at the United desk or Lufthansa desk, because they're partnering on these flights and these tickets, and I won't leave until they give me on a plane. So even if my flight, again, is canceled, I'll insist that they send me. We do have bus showings that have been confirmed. We will be starting the bus tour, resuming the bus tour, August 14th, a month from today, in Prairie du Chien, Wisconsin, at the library, sponsored by the library and the local Chamber of Commerce. It'll be held down at the park on the river. The reason I'm mentioning this is we've had to be very clever, and we've had to reconceptualize our bus. In the meantime, since I've been stranded here, I and Christine and Veronica and her sister Alyssa and others, we've been working feverishly to be clever. How do we adapt our bus to Corona? So we've now got railings, thanks to Matthew at the Vanderhaeg's depot in Kansas City, that we can actually put the interior panels on the outside of the bus. No one, quote, has to go into the bus anymore who doesn't want to go in the bus, although the bookshop will remain in the bus, and we fund much of our tour through these book sales, and they're all related to the topics we talk about. So people can view the panels outside where they'll be hung. On days when a rainstorm is expected, we'll try to find an alternate either under an awning or in a mechanic shop or somewhere. We have shown the bus inside. In fact, in February and March, we showed the bus indoors exclusively until we got to Kansas City. Also, all of our films that are part of the bus experience are online. Our exhibit text is online. People can preview the films and read the text, but we hope they'll still come. They can stand socially distant from each other as they look at the panels on 3 sides of the bus. And we're also going to do a new thing called the listening circles. At the moment, many of us would like to talk about our current crises. There are many. You can just pick your crisis. But people also want to be heard. And so we're going to try something sort of a la Quakerism every top of the hour when we're showing the bus. So 10, 12, 2, 4, 6, 8. We'll have 15 minutes of quiet. And people can sit 1.5 meters apart. And after we've had some time to think and to be quiet, then people are welcome to share their thoughts from that quarter hour of quiet. We ask them not to talk about them or the government or anything that's not personal, but rather to speak from their own experience. How's it been for them the last few months? What are their wishes going forward? How would they like to see their world being different? What do they think about the stories on the bus? What do they know of their family's experience with the flu pandemic or with the KKK or any other stories? So we're calling them listening circles. And we encourage people to sit and to actually listen to each other and not always have that verbal monologue in their own head. What do they want to talk about, but to really listen to each other. And when it's their turn to also share uninterrupted and hopefully not directly judged. It's not a time for arguments or even discussion. It's just a time for people to share and for others to listen. So that's our big change on the top of the odd hours. So that would be 9, 11, 1. You can do the math. It'd be short programs by me. I'll also try to keep my comments to about 10 to 15 minutes. And then people can ask questions. And then we can have discussions about the Klan of the 20s, racism today if they want. We can talk about the pandemic of 1918, 1919, or of today. Anything's game, and it's more of a discussion format. So these are some of the changes that we're making to be relevant. We're hoping that there'll be such a hunger among people for cultural events and also to listen and to talk to each other that people will come. We're just producing a new sandwich board sign where we ask people to wear their mask, even if they don't want to do it for themselves, to do it for me, because there will be hundreds of people going around the bus over the next 2.5 months. I will be exposed to people who have the virus. I know this. I will be wearing a mouth mask, and a facial shield. I'll have 2 levels of protection. But this I will do, not because I'm a martyr, but it has to be done. So we're going to do the bus. We'll try to keep the crowd always down to 25 or fewer at any time. Also social distancing, and we'll ask people over 25 per head to form a line. And then as people cycle out, we'll bring in new people. So I'm really excited that this fills a need that people have, I think.
So you've been talking about the Buseum.
Yeah.
The traveling museum, which I don't know if there've been other cases of it in the world. I don't know if this is the first Buseum of the world. I have a feeling, I know that back some years ago, there were bookmobiles and other things, ways to travel with culture to the people. Did you innovate this idea of the Buseum?
Actually, I had a very strange experience. It was almost spiritual. I was flying back to the States at one point from Germany. Either I was still living in Berlin doing my doctoral work or something happened, but the plane got put into loop pattern. We couldn't land at JFK or LaGuardia. I think it was JFK. And we kept looping over and over Brooklyn and Queens. What do you think about when you spend half an hour looping over Queens and Brooklyn? I kept looking down and seeing the same bus yard, and I kept seeing all these yellow rectangular lines looking like yellow ants feeding on some spilled honey after a picnic. So all these yellow little rectangles were feeding on something. Of course, they were parked in storage. And I thought, school buses, they all have, 6 wheels or more. They have a floor. They have literally a platform, a base that we could do things with. They're empty. So we did indeed in the early 2000s get an old school bus, Buseum 1, and later we had Buseum 2. Now we're on Buseum 3 because we wear them out. And literally, this is a mobile platform that we can take these exhibits, these ideas, through the countryside, and people can come to us. So even if they would never leave rural Nebraska or the northern woods of Minnesota or even south side of Chicago and go to an exhibit or go to a speech or go to a public discussion, when we bring the culture to them, they will go. In fact, once we had an engine fire. I was on the way to Sac Base near Omaha and looked out the rearview mirror going down the freeway west of Des Moines. There were flames and smoke going on the back of the bus. It had caught on fire. We took the same exhibit in boxes to those hosts that didn't jump ship in Nebraska, and it was different. We showed the exhibit. I gave programs. People enjoyed them. But a third of the libraries jumped ship. The bus itself is an attraction. People want to go to the bus. So we're going to bring it to a wide audience now, in fact, to hopefully Eau Claire, Wisconsin. We'll talk about that later.
Right. And you have this organized. You said we a number of times, but we only see Michael Lewick-Tromms here right now. So who is we? Traces, Bourne. Explain the infrastructure that makes the Buseum possible.
People see me because I have the biggest mouth and I'm most willing to talk. There's Christine. She's been with us since Christmas. We met at the winter solstice in Decorah, Iowa, outside over a roaring fire and a groaning dessert table. There are two sisters, the Gaiadur sisters, Veronica and her sister Alyssa. They're very helpful. We have interns, Dimitri, who I've been working with this morning. He's back in his native Republic of Georgia, but he does our signage. He just created a new sandwich board that we're going to have to show people where to go, social distance wise, etc. So there are different players. Yesterday I had a meeting, or this morning I had a meeting with 6 people here in Erfurt. This programming will continue when I return in November to Germany. So there are people who cycle in and cycle out. We have staff. We have money. Again, we'll actually pay Christine for the hours. We've not been able to pay her recently. I don't get paid, but I do it out of conviction. The Gaiadur sisters are volunteers. Dimitri gets a remuneration and is also an intern. And we have other people. So people come in different capacities for different lengths of time. And without all those people, I couldn't do what I do. So in a way, they support me because they believe in the project.
And what is the purpose? And what is the purpose, the intent of Traces, of Sporn? Is it to subvert the system, to bring enlightenment, to bring back the Christ? I mean, why not? I mean, you could have a religious intent like that too. What actually have you written into your intent?
Because we do get public monies from time to time. At the moment, I can't think of any public monies that are financing the coming tour, but certainly we have in the past. We've had grants from Wisconsin, Iowa, Indiana, Nebraska, Illinois humanities organizations, and so we cannot take a religious or political stance per se, and we don't. So this whole idea now with the listening circles, even that I say it's sort of tapping a Quaker tradition, I suppose I might be able to say that with public funds being used, but I wouldn't do it. I can do it now because I'm not holding to anybody along a party line or a not party line. Changing the system is not a bad idea. We're not here particularly to foment revolution, although a revolution might be overdue. What is true is there's a revolution going on by itself anyway, independent of the bus. When we conceptualized this bus, there wasn't COVID that we knew about. George Floyd had not yet been murdered. He was still walking around free and alive. Then we outfitted the bus in February, and soon thereafter, COVID landed in Europe and in the United States, as far as we knew. And Christine said, I never imagined when I said in December over, roasted weenies and marshmallows in the Winter Solstice Festival that these topics have become so germane. With the killer 1918 pandemic story, there are obvious links, but also with the cow wars. And I'm hoping that you and I, Mark, can talk about the cow wars soon. The cow wars are really about the social strife of the 1930s. farmer desperation. The farmers' depression began 10 years before the Great Depression. So farmers were already hurting at the end of World War I, 1919, not like Wall Street that collapsed in 1929. But also we talk in that slideshow about the starving automobile line workers in Detroit. We talk about the deportation between 250,000 and 350,000 Hispanic Americans who our government rounded up often in the night and sent to Mexico, quote, back to Mexico, although many had been born in the US and were citizens. We talk about the Veterans Army called the Bonus Army when 40,000 US veterans occupied Washington. I think it was 31, 32. So that story becomes relevant again because now you've got, 10 to 15% unemployment in the United States, mass unemployment. And then, of course, with the murder of George Floyd, our KKK story is more relevant than ever in recent past. So 3 of our 5 topics are completely germane right now, and we didn't plan this. It just sort of happened. So to not take the bus out is actually a crime. It's certainly an insult to the work of many people who've made it possible, to the sponsorship of John Vanderhaeghe, of Vanderhaeghe's Ink and Spencer, to Joey, who today I called and pestered to print another sign. We have people who donate signs and tires and metalwork and a monitor for people have donated several tens of thousands of dollars worth of support. So to not show the bus is missing a historical moment, and it's squandering what we have. And that's part of the consideration when I think about, do I come and risk my life? Do I sit in a tin can with wings for 9 hours going from here to Chicago to Kansas City? Yeah.
Well, thank you for making that effort, that taking that risk is really what I'm thinking about. You've mentioned 3 of the 5 exhibits. You want to mention something about the other 2, and then let's drill down
Yes.
on the white cancer.
The first exhibit, looking chronologically, is called Kicking the Kaiser, Anti-German Hysteria, World War I. I had an interview yesterday with a nice young woman from the Capital Times, the newspaper of Madison, Wisconsin, and I told her that during World War I, there were serious proposals to put a fence around Wisconsin to protect against all those treasonous Germans living in Wisconsin. Of course, Milwaukee at one point was a socialist-run city. Beer halls and Turnerverein, the sports halls all across Wisconsin, it's well known. We've forgotten what happened to German Americans across the whole country during World War I. Some were beaten. At least one was lynched, Robert Prager in East St. Louis, Illinois. German Americans' property was taken away. Several thousand were interned in 3 camps in Georgia, North Carolina, and Utah. So we've forgotten this story. And one of the reasons it's really relevant is every 5th American has German ancestry today. If you take Hispanic Americans and divide them by Cuban Americans, Mexican Americans, and others, German Americans are still the largest ethnic group in the country, still. Certainly in the 19-teens, it was by far the largest minority. So an interesting question is, how do you take the largest minority and make them invisible? So the first of these 5 topics I find very interesting as a mental game. We do talk about President Trump's grandfather, who, like my great-great, came from Germany and later opened a hotel on the frontier, the Trumps in Yukon and the Lewigs in pioneer-era Iowa. So we talk about German Americans, how they helped build the country, and then during World War I got hit in the head, and now German American culture is mostly invisible. The 5th of the 5, I mentioned the other 3 already, is about bootlegging in Prohibition era. What's interesting is how these 5 stories all dovetail. The case study that we give were the German American bootleggers of Templeton, Iowa, who were supplying Al Capone in Chicago, and certainly speakeasies in Omaha, maybe Milwaukee, I don't know, Kansas City, maybe St. Louis, but they were running booze all through the upper Midwest. And the Klan in Carroll, Iowa, and other places would come and burn crosses outside of Templeton because these were German American Catholics. And this does give us a nice segue to the story of the white cancer. One of our 5 stories is America's White Cancer, the KKK, the second wave, the so-called second wave of the 1920s. Just briefly, I'll give a sketch, and then we can actually take these and disassemble this bit by bit. In the film that Mark has watched last night, because I said, Mark, watch this film, everyone can see on our YouTube channel that the Klan arose out of the ruins of the Civil War. The Klan sort of disappeared after the mid-70s and was revived by a big cross burning on Stone Mountain outside of Atlanta, Thanksgiving Eve, 1915. Plus, there was the film The Birth of a Nation, which quoted the President Wilson as supposedly being pro-Klan. And this really got it going. During World War I, although we weren't yet in it, the writing was pretty clear on the wall, and soon we would be in World War I. But all issues of origin and race and grouping became very important. If you were a Hungarian American or a German American or whatever, all these things were of importance. In the 1920s, even after the war was over, the anti-German, anti-Catholic sentiment of the Klan helped lead to prohibition, because German beer gardens all over the Midwest and the rest of the country got hit in the head. They had to close. So being against booze was also being against mostly the German brewers. Leinenkugel, Pabst, Hahn, Miller, which was probably Müller at one point. So all these things are related. What's interesting for me, of the described 3 million members, I mean, that's the number that the Klan itself gave in the 20s. Every six...
Just a moment. It's hanging. Just a moment. Wait. It's the recording will not be good here.
Okay.
It's hanging. Just hold on. Just keep holding. It's doing a reboot. Let me make sure. Speak now. See if it comes through clearly.
All right. I was talking about the Klan.
It seems to be back. So.
Okay. So the women had just gotten the vote in 1920 in the United States, and the Klan of the 1920s supposedly had 3 million members. That's what the Klan itself said. But every 6th Klan person was a woman. And so on our slideshow, on our PowerPoint, this sort of an animated little movie, you actually see moving figures of the great Klan rallies in Washington, D.C. of the 20s, and ladies' contingents, ladies' auxiliaries who were in hoods and masks as well. So this is really interesting that, you know, the Klan was an equal opportunity hater. And outside of the South, the fuel that really made those pistons run among the Klan in the Midwest and the West Coast wasn't particularly anti-Black, but anti-Catholic. And I find that very interesting. And that brings us to these topics I thought about while swimming this morning. Mark wanted to take this discussion deeper and wider, and we can certainly do that, because at some point, racism as an excuse or as an explanation doesn't work anymore. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. What is the roots? Because we say racism, but often it's bigotry of some sort. I've been to Rwanda. I've seen them places where the Hutu and the Tutsi, where the Tutsi were slaughtered. I was in one place where something like, what was it? In one place it was 5,000. Another place it was about 18,000. It was a church where they had been slaughtered. And so that's obviously black. You talk about German versus Koreans, the prejudice that is long-standing, and the enmity and even the slaughter, slavery, etc. So I know it happens all over the world, and it's not just racism, but it is somehow how we draw circles of we and they.
Yes.
Some essential part of it. But let's get to that eventually. So again, we're talking about the first wave of the Klan only goes for maybe like 10 years or so.
Less, 8 or so, 7, 8.
Mm-hmm. And in that time, what is the purpose of the Klan?
That's a very important question for this reason. So the Klan in the 1860s and early 70s was established in large part to terrorize recently freed African Americans. They would ride at night, and therefore you get, torches, you get men on horseback, you get robes and hoods to cloak one's identity. Some Klan members themselves of the first wave said They dressed up ridiculously, and the early outfits were different. They had different insignias and sort of mystical. There are pictures in the web. It didn't all look like what we think of today's Klan, so white robes and hoods. They dressed up, they said, to scare African Americans. And one of the reasons that some of them wore white costumes to look ghost-like, because there was the reputation, the image, the myth that Black people in the South were particularly superstitious, and that you could scare them by wearing white sheets to look like a ghost. And so these men would run around at night on horses or on foot, intimidating. And they said part of the getup was, to look like ghosts. At any rate, they wanted to create a new order. The former slaves were no longer enslaved, at least officially, although we know that economically there were ways to get people back into dependency in the company store, so to speak. Sharecroppers, tenant farmers. And also, besides just keeping, quote, Blacks in their place, there was the idea of setting the narrative. This quickened and morphed as of the late 80s, 90s, when especially the widows and daughters of the Confederate soldiers and officers began, the Daughters of the Confederacy, I think I've got that right, and they began to erect all their statues across the South, hundreds or a couple thousand. And those statues were to set up a certain narrative. And the narrative that they especially wanted to sell and to eternalize in stone and brass and bronze was the lost cause narrative, that white Southerners were fighting for states' rights. It wasn't about slavery. It was about states having the right to leave the Union, and which is something that necessary. You have to establish in a republic or a democracy the right for states to opt out. But, the right to do what? The right to sustain slavery. Which does bring us, unless Mark's going to plead again to take a detour, does bring us back to the topic of today. I don't mean just what I want to talk about, but what's going on in the country. There is a revolution.
Sure. Sure, because we've got the whole question of what is history. As statues have been taken down, the false narrative, I believe, the talking point from the people who want the Confederate statues and et cetera to stay there is, well, that's just history. We have to teach history. But in fact, from what you just said, it's a false history.
It's certainly a contrived history. It's certainly one that was purposely encapsulated in stone and metal to pillar it, to anchor it in the public consciousness on cemetery grounds, on boulevards. Go to Richmond. I've been there with the bus. This Boulevard Avenue, what it was called, with all the statues, and it ends with the big 6-story tall statue of Robert E. Lee on the horse, which now, the mayor says is going to get rid of. You can debate, was the story false or not, until the cows come home. I don't want to do that now, but what I do want to say is that in a revolution, the revolutionaries say we're rejecting that narrative. And I live in a country that's had